Friedrich Nietzsche might be one of the most divisive figures in the last couple of hundred years of philosophical thought, and maybe all of Western philosophy. Um, there's been a lot of ink spilled over him, whether he was a proto-Nazi or an anti-Semite or whatever else. And I'll talk about some of those ideas in this review. But this is another one of those books about Nietzsche. This just happens to be one that's a little bit better than average. It's by Robert C. Solomon, who passed away suddenly about 5 years ago, but who is at the University of Texas at Austin. And the book is called Living with Nietzsche: What the Great Immoralist Has to Teach Us. And like I said, Nietzsche really seems to be a figure that draws perennial criticism, especially people denying him the sort of charitable, broad reading that he really deserves and needs, I think, in order to be fully understood. There are apparently those who continue to find some sort of satisfaction in identifying Nietzsche as a moral or ethical nihilist, or, like I said, a prototypical Nazi, or some right-wing monster, generally speaking. For those interested in a wonderful, articulate, and well-historicized refutation of these views, I would recommend a book by Walter Kaufmann, called Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist. But Robert Solomon's Living with Nietzsche, while lacking that biographical nature of Kaufmann's work, really does serve as an extended apology for the continued relevance and centrality of Nietzsche's thought. Solomon doesn't bother with much of the territory that people might want him to cover, like his discontent with Christianity, for example. Instead, he focuses in on a small number of issues which run more fully through his thought, including Nietzsche's defense of the passions, moral perspectivism, and the concept of resentment, which doesn't quite mean as the same thing as the word Nietzsche used, which is ressentiment. He always used the French word. There are also incisively funny sections which defend Nietzsche's penchant for ad hominem attacks, with Solomon suggesting that in some circumstances the ad hominem attack isn't actually a logical fallacy at all. And I won't spell out the details of the argument here, but it's slightly convincing. Central to Solomon's arguments throughout the book is that Nietzsche is not in fact a moral nihilist at all, but instead actually rests very closely to Aristotle's conception of virtue ethics, that overused phrase, and now all too often thrown around in the circles of moral philosophy. But he argues that virtue ethics was really quite close to where Nietzsche was. In fact, it's very difficult to imagine Nietzsche's unabashed elitism without a kind of virtue ethics. In this book, Solomon does a great job at showing how Nietzsche's thought works in concert with the history of philosophy. This book, I think, would be more appreciated by someone at least passingly familiar with Nietzsche's work, who had at least read, The Antichrist, and maybe a couple of other more notable pieces by him. Otherwise, the topics that Solomon chooses will seem a little bit out of left field, since they aren't necessarily the ones that are most connected with the name of Nietzsche in the popular imagination. Of course, if you're already familiar with his work and have given it the charitable reading that I mentioned above, the chances aren't nearly as high that you'll need Solomon's corrective approach in fully appreciating Nietzsche in the first place. But since Nietzsche does have that horrible reputation and has been sullied after his death, mostly by his sister, who was very amenable to the right-wing proto-Nazi ideas that have so often been associated with Nietzsche himself, this is a good book to sort of disabuse those ideas. Again, the Kaufman book, too, is wonderful. However, judging from some of the kooky things that are still shamelessly said about him, I would recommend this for those people who think, as I do, that it's best to err on the side of caution, right, and make sure that you get a real full appreciation by someone who's obviously read his entire corpus and thought about it extensively, like Solomon and like Kaufman have. Nietzsche, even with all of his rhetorical Sturm und Drang, and perhaps because of it, always, to me at least, repays judicious reading. Good book. Living with Nietzsche. What the Great Immoralist Has to Teach Us by Robert Solomon.